Hello, my name is G4, and I'm here to talk to you today about modeling modern transit systems. This is part one of what I'm calling my Modern Modeling Anthology, where I'm going to go over the topic of modern transit and show you how it relates to traditional modeling. In part two, I'm going to zoom in on DMUs and show you how you can make layouts and track plans and operating schemes with it. And part three, well, let's just say it's one of my all-time favorite titles, and probably the thing I'm most proud for bringing into the world. Proto-freelancing in the wrong direction, my accidental quest to model the near future. Anyway, so a brief introduction to myself. Again, my name is G4. I'm a graduate student in molecular and astrobiology, and I have one academic byline to my name. I also have a slight problem with traveling. I kind of have a lot of places that I want to go and visit a lot of places along the way. And then, oddly enough, compared to what I'm going to be talking to you about today, is I actually model in ON30 in the 1890s. And I'm also, quite possibly, the first openly trans non-binary model railroader, and the 18 quadrillionth autistic model railroader. So this presentation actually came out of a side project that I do, the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading podcast. In episode 14, I decided to give a history of all of railroading in North America, and then I basically stumbled on the transition from regular old-fashioned streetcars to modern transit, and I kind of became obsessed to the point where I made this presentation. But as for this presentation, I'm going to start by sharing with you what I've learned about modern transit systems. I'll start by giving you a history of transit, show you how modern transit evolved from that, and then teach you about the specifics of light rail transit, streetcars, and diesel multiple units. I'll end with some modeling ideas, and then encourage some political action and hobby outreach. And a slight note, for this and all subsequent presentations, every single image has been lovingly plagiarized from the internet. So anyway, let's begin. As for the history of transit, well, of course, it all started with cabbies, private for hire cabs going around major cities. But then along came the omnibus, meaning for everyone in Latin, and later shortened to bus. And these basically ran on fixed schedules, and you could hop on and hop off at your leisure. Of course, once you had a fixed route and a schedule, you may as well turn it into a horse car route, and this absolutely revolutionized travel, in part because it lowered the fare. But it was very expensive to run. You had to have 10 times as many horses as you did per horse car, and there were also certain disposal costs, like the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894 in Chicago. But then in 1884 came along the first ever public display of the streetcar at the Cotton Centennial Exhibition, I believe in New Orleans. It was a simple affair. It encircled the grounds and offered people a quick ride from one side of the exhibition to the other. 1 year later, in 1885, the first ever purpose-built streetcar opened in the nearby city of Montgomery, Alabama, and 1 year after that, in 1886, Scranton, Pennsylvania became the first city to completely electrify all of its horse car lines, giving it the moniker of the Electric City. And this absolutely revolutionized the world as we know it today. By 1895, so a decade after they were invented, the country went from 0 to 18,000 kilometers of streetcars, with 1,600 in Los Angeles alone. And cities absolutely exploded, and this helped to define urban culture, in part because everywhere became accessible. People had better access to more jobs, but they also could live outside of a city in a streetcar suburb and commute into it. And this also helped to influence culture as well, with things like joyrides and trolley parks, which of course gave way to modern theme parks. But, of course, we can't talk about the streetcar without talking about its death at the hands of Detroit. As streetcar systems were closed, unused streetcars were piled higher and higher and eventually burned to get scrap metal. And this actually was the result of a conspiracy. General Motors and several other Detroit-area auto manufacturers created something called the National City Lines, which purchased a bunch of different streetcar networks through about 24 different cities around the country, and then closed them prematurely, forcing people to buy automobiles. A lot of people think that this is a conspiracy, but this actually was litigated, I believe, in the Supreme Court, and GM did have to pay a fine. But unfortunately, the damage was done, and the trolley networks were lost. Incidentally, this is also the plot of the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But anyway, this led into the modern world with a bunch of modern problems, not the least of which being automobility, which wastes time and gas, delays emergency vehicles, creates chemical and sound pollution, which itself creates stress, not just for people driving, but also for people who live near major automotive thoroughfares. Downtown spaces are converted into parking. This increases vehicle maintenance and depreciation, of course increasing collisions and deaths, and all of this totals to a $305 billion loss annually. So put one way, Interestingly, traffic alone is the 24th largest state by GDP. Put another way, 1.5% of the entire United States economy revolves around just wasting time and gas and mechanical wear sitting in traffic going nowhere. And then put a final way, if SUVs alone, not including cars or trucks, if just SUVs were their own country, they would be the 6th largest carbon-emitting nation in the world. So clearly, this is a problem. And there's unambiguous scholarly data that car dependency is bad. But my favorite data comes from this paper, which I believe analyzed Kansas City. And you can see here in red shades is income-adjusted obesity rates, and then in the green circles are the walkability index. And it is plainly clear to the eye, you can see just by looking at it, that there is a linear regression. The more walkable a neighborhood, the less obese the people are who live there. So cars are literally killing us and making us less healthy. But they're also not just doing that. They're killing our cities and making our cities less healthy as well. Here's Cincinnati before the age of the automobile. You can see a nice, dense city with a core downtown and a bunch of neighborhoods abutting up against it. Here is Cincinnati today, where you can see that massive blocks have been entirely cut open in order to make way for highway interchanges. But it's not just Cincinnati. Here's Detroit before. Again, a very nice, dense, successful city. Here is Detroit now. You can see how the downtown has been entirely cut off by urban rivers, emoting itself away from the city that it actually serves. Here's Milwaukee before, here's Milwaukee after. Massive amounts of downtown real estate right next to downtown have been chopped up and given over to parking lots and large highway interchanges. And one of the worst cities, Minneapolis before, Minneapolis after. You can see with the size of some of these highway intersections that they literally decimated entire neighborhoods. And interestingly, that was actually the point. Allow me to introduce to you one of the most evil men in all of history, Robert Moses. He was head of the New York City Highway Department in the 1940s, and he specifically routed highways through majority-minority neighborhoods in order to force them to be removed from the city. And this isn't just a modern woke perspective. Here are the words from the man's mouth himself. I raise my stein to the builder who can remove ghettos without removing people, as I hail the chef who can make omelets without breaking eggs. So yeah, explicitly evil. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have people such as Jane Jacobs, whose seminal treatise, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, helped to define modern urban planning, or at least what we attempt to do. She was actually, she got her start as a small local community organizer in a tiny little neighborhood. You may have heard of it, Greenwich Village. She actually saved it from demolition from another one of Robert Moses' highways. But part of her work and others has helped to reveal the phenomenon of induced demand. What a lot of people think is that if you have a clogged highway, if you just add a few extra lanes in order to give more space for the cars to run, you can unclog it. But that's actually not the case. The thing that's consistent is people's willingness to sit in traffic. So if you now have a new, quickly flowing highway, more people will then be incentivized to buy cars or take cars for trips they otherwise could have taken by foot or transit, and then they will get back on that same highway and bring it to about the exact same level of congestion before. And this has actually been proven scientifically. Now, this actually operates conversely as well, with a phenomenon called reduced demand. What a lot of communities these days have been doing is engaging in something called road diets, where you rechannelize roads in order to get rid of automobile traffic lanes and instead replace them with things like protected cycle tracks, transit-only lanes, or just simply wider sidewalks. And even though it's counterintuitive, multimodal streets that are less car-dependent actually have a higher person throughput hourly. And this might be counterintuitive to some, but there's a very simple reason why it works. And to demonstrate this, here is an experiment done in Seattle, I believe about a decade or two ago. In fact, actually, I think it was done on Fifth Avenue, a street that I commuted to a university on for quite a while. But anyway, here's 200 people in 177 cars. They go 5 lanes wide and 5 blocks back. But if you remove the cars from around the people, you can see what a terrible waste of space this is. Every single person requires at least 225 square feet for the rest of their private automobile, and that's not accounting for the fact that lanes, especially on highways, are sometimes twice as wide as the cars that run down them. But if you take everybody, all 200 people, and put them on bicycles, you can reduce their lane usage by a fifth, but also all 200 people fit on only 3 buses. So the reason why transit works better than cars, it isn't a matter of lifestyle, it isn't a matter of ideology, it is simply a matter of geometry, and that can never be beaten. And so, recognizing this, a lot of major cities have been engaged in high-profile highway removal projects, like the Alaskan Way Viaduct in Seattle or the Embarcadero Expressway in San Francisco. Anyway, getting off my soapbox here, you might be wondering to yourself, what does this have to do with trains anyway? Well, suffering from massive amounts of traffic, in the 1960s and 70s, cities decided to look to what had been done before to see if they could reinvent them and update them for modern subjects. And of course, an important aspect of this are the old-fashioned subways in New York and Boston. And so, in the Great Society era, several major Reagan-era metros were built, like the Washington Metro in D.C. and the MARTA in Atlanta. And they did have high capacity, and some of them were actually quite successful, but also all of them had a hellaciously high cost, and many of them had poor implementations and bad station land use design, and they're also few in number and partially underground, so I really won't be discussing them much here. But the other major examples include BART in San Francisco, the Metro in Miami, and then also a single line in Baltimore. And you can see here that some of them did have a nice subway-style grid network, allowing you to get around the city, and then others didn't quite as much. But also during this time, some streetcars did hang on. Of course, famously, the New Orleans streetcars in Louisiana, which have been operating with their same vehicles for, I think, 12 decades now. But also other things like the Newark subway, the Mattapan-Ashmont high-speed line in Boston, and then also Muni in San Francisco. So during the 1960s, there was a push for so-called streetcar subways. The idea being you still had a few streetcar lines hanging on, but unfortunately they suffered from traffic whenever they got into downtown. So why not just take all of them and duck them underneath street level, just one level below the ground, in order to make the streetcars move faster. And this was done in San Francisco with Muni, the MBTA in Boston, and SEPTA in Philadelphia. And some of them did have nice modernish subway-style stations. Others were more gutters through which the streetcars could ooze between picking up people. Also during this time, if you're putting money into new infrastructure for the streetcar routes, you may as well buy new streetcars as well. And so SEPTA bought these really interesting toasters from Kawasaki in the 1980s, but Muni and the MBTA both decided to buy something called the U.S. Standard Light Rail Vehicle by Boeing Vertol, which was an unmitigated disaster. Literally, the factory could not deliver new vehicles fast enough for the maintenance departments to rob them of replacement parts. It was very bad, but they did set a precedent for so-called rapid tramways, or more British-style light railways. So these were followed by a few other systems, like the T in Pittsburgh and the RTA in Cleveland, both of which adapted from previous streetcar systems to make first-generation light rail. Now, interestingly, in 1978, something new was happening in Edmonton, Canada. They wanted to build a streetcar subway, but they got rid of all their streetcars, and they wanted to build a Reagan-era subway, but they didn't exactly have the money for it. So they did a kind of a compromise. They repurposed an existing freight rail corridor, and they bought these interesting high-floor German vehicles, but they also had turnstiles and station agents at stations, and there was a very heavy emphasis for park-and-ride traveling, and they didn't actually go to any of the neighborhoods that it served, and then overall it took about 40 years to extend beyond the initial 7-mile line meaningfully, so it kind of looks somewhat new, like a modern light rail system, but it was a very odd implementation of it. But 4 years later, we finally get true second-generation light rail, both Calgary and San Diego opening in 1981. And these are a little bit different in that they were intended as networks from the start, they were much better integrated into the urban fabric, and they were also regularly expanded up until just a few months ago for San Diego. And these are much more incredibly successful systems. So you might be wondering to yourself, what exactly is light rail transit and what makes it different from a regular streetcar? Well, for one, LRT is faster. It does have some completely exclusive right-of-way. Also, some routes are realigned in order to make them straighter, and sometimes stations are dropped, having about one station per neighborhood or so. LRT also has dedicated stations with platforms, making it safer and more ADA accessible, but also offering a better waiting experience. They also have new vehicles, which offer faster acceleration and more rider comforts. They also have higher capacities. The vehicles can be MU'd together into longer trains, and they also have more frequent service. Very rarely do you find a light rail system with LRVs coming less frequently than every 15 minutes. And all of this work together in order to attract higher ridership than if the route were a streetcar or a bus network. And this actually has been termed a phenomenon called the light rail magnet. Basically, quoting directly from a scholarly article, LRT can attract more demand than an equivalent bus service. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the Seattle Light Rail, with which I'm most familiar. If it was a bus route, it would be absolutely awful, in part because it misses all of the major population centers, it misses all the major employment centers, it has a long stretch without any stations at all, and then it also doesn't have a direct route into downtown. But because it's a train, people actually love it. The initial starter line, opened in 2009, was so successful that it alone, a single line, would have been the fourth largest transit agency in the state by ridership. And this ultimately endeared the entire region to the concept of light rail, and they approved a $54 billion expansion, one of the largest transit projects in a single city in U.S. history. And so, as a result, ridership has seen a growth on light rail more than any other means of transportation over about the past 30 years, as you can see from these data here. And again, you might be wondering, what makes light rail transit so successful? Well, I think it comes down to two things. First off, it's infrastructural design, and second off, it's vehicles. So as far as infrastructure goes, LRT usually has something called transit signal priority, which means that a vehicle can communicate with an approaching intersection, and it can either extend a green or shorten a red in order to keep the transit vehicle moving. Another one is that it usually has dedicated lanes. Even when it shares a road with mixed traffic, either the lane is exclusive to the transit or they are limited access, allowing the transit vehicle to hop through intersections and not be caught in the same traffic as the cars next to it, making the transit faster moving and then therefore incentivizing more people to take it. Finally, modern transit also has a very heavy emphasis on intermodal hubs, making it a place where a bunch of different modes of transit come together and allowing easy transfers from one to the next. Thus, a single means of transportation doesn't have to be the end-all be-all solution to an entire region's transit woes. Instead, it can coordinate with a bunch of other existing modes of transit in order to better blanket the city with transit options. Moving on to light rail vehicles, or LRVs, the first LRV actually dates all the way back to Boston in 1913. Okay, well, not really, but it technically was articulated, so I like to think that it did anyway. But in terms of real LRVs, one major manufacturer is Kinki Sharyo, and they a Japanese company. They had boxy starts here in Dallas, and then also with the VTA in San Jose. But they did standardize the setup of the so-called ABA setup, or 2 rooms and a bath, where you have 2 larger end cars and then one kind of a trailing unit in the middle that they both rely on. So 3 trucks, 6 axles, ABA setup. They also later helped to define modern light rail vehicle styling, like you can see here in Seattle, with much smoother, sleeker appearances. And recently they've started working on so-called super light rail vehicles, or ABCBAs, seen here in Newark and Jersey City. But one of the oldest light rail vehicles, like I mentioned earlier, is the Siemens Juweg U2, which was a German vehicle from the 1950s imported to American standards, seen here in San Diego and Sacramento. Then in the 1980s, they modernized the design with the ST400 and 460, seen here in Pittsburgh and St. Louis. Then along came the SD100 and 160, which fixed the mechanics in the 1990s, seen here in Salt Lake and Denver. And then in the early 2000s came along the SD660, which was one of the first major standard light rail vehicle designs. They fixed the amenities, had a 70% all low-floored level boarding design, and then also they finally adopted the ABA setup. Both of these are seen here in Portland. More recently, they fixed the styling to modern aesthetics with the SD70 and 700 in the 2010s, seen here in Salt Lake and Seattle. And then recently, they've retroactively rebranded everything as just the S700, fixing the center B unit seating to the more popular bucket seating design. And they also now offer a US or ultra short model, as you can see here in the diagram, which can operate as a standalone streetcar. And you can see the S700 here in Charlotte, and on the right here in Seattle, you can see the S700 next to the old Kinki Sharyos, showing their subtle differences. Now, during this time, there was also a parallel revolution going on with streetcars. So for a long while, there had been so-called heritage bootstraps. Technically, these were roving museums aimed at tourists, but they were actually integrated with the city's fare structure, allowing business people a circulator around downtown in order to get to a restaurant for lunch, say. And you can see examples of this here in Memphis and Dallas. But in 2001, along came Portland. It has a famously multipolar smaller downtown, such that even though it has one of the largest light rail networks in the entire country, if you took the light rail into downtown, the downtown is so large that you still might end up having to walk a full mile and a half to your final destination. So in order to solve this problem of a last mile service, they built a streetcar using a Czechoslovakian-built vehicles, which they later built domestically in Portland. And they expanded it incrementally to become a three-route streetcar system, the largest network in the country. Also uniquely, Portland's streetcar actually shares a short segment of track with its light rail system. It's the only place in the country I'm aware of that actually does this. This inspired the so-called Transit Christmas from the Obama administration with the Small Starts program. And the idea behind this was to bring initial starter lines, especially of streetcars, to places that didn't have rail transit as a system from which a larger system could nucleate. And they were usually under 6 kilometers in length, usually only a single line. And you can see examples of this here in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is okay. The Hop in Milwaukee, which is actually quite successful. They're currently expanding it. And then also there's that one in Oklahoma, which is very nope. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So now that we've gone over all of this, let's look at modern transit from the perspective of modeling. What are the details that would be important if you wanted to model these systems? And since we were just talking about it, let's start with streetcars. And this here is the Q line in Detroit. So streetcars have now actually consumed Motor City itself. I actually like it. It's a plucky system. So unfortunately, a lot of streetcars are downtown circulators, not necessarily the best thing in the world. Like you can see the Cincinnati Bell Connector, it only serves downtown and takes a looping route. And then on the right, you can see the Oklahoma City streetcar, which is just terribly designed. They wanted to bring the streetcar to the front stoop of literally every attraction in downtown, and they have this incredibly loopy and unproductive affair here. It's just all bad, very no. And unfortunately, this has led to some unintended consequences. Among them, that streetcars are actually being built more from the perspective of renewing downtown and improving land speculation than actually providing a good transit system. And probably the worst example of this is the Atlanta streetcar named Undesirable, 48-ton transit inchworms, and the worst transportation project ever built. And you can see quite plainly here why it's such a bad system. Even though Atlanta has a very large subway system, the streetcar actually only has one transfer to the subway at Peachtree Center. But if you were to pick up the streetcar there, it's going in the wrong direction and only goes 2 stops before turning around. So the only real direction that taking the streetcar in would be useful would be going to the King Historic District. But to actually get to that streetcar stop going in that direction, you have to walk 6 blocks from the subway station to Park Place. It is just a terrible design. It's just all bad. But thankfully, not all streetcars are absolute garbage. Some of them are actually quite successful, like the Kansas City streetcar on the left. They're currently doubling its length to a university just south of downtown. And then one of my all-time favorites is the Sunlink in Tucson, which is very well designed because even though it has kind of a bit of a weird route on the map, if you actually go on the ground, every single inch of the streetcar's route, it is the center of attention. So they did a very good job here by routing the streetcar to the places where people already wanted to go. It's incredibly successful, and I like it a lot. Also, streetcars have been upgraded in their physical plans. Old-fashioned streetcar stops were, at best, mere patches of asphalt, and at worst, you had to get off in the middle of the street, having to cross a lane of active traffic, which is just a very bad design, because, people could get hurt. But modern streetcars actually have dedicated stations, like you can see here in Seattle. Even though it's low profile, it is a dedicated and protected space from the surrounding traffic for pedestrians to wait. And then also, I love how Toronto solved this problem by just simply removing a lane of car traffic and bringing the sidewalk up to where the streetcar tracks already were from 100 years ago. Streetcars are also often integrated with public art and public plaza projects, and some of the idea behind this is that if you already are doing heavy construction in a neighborhood, ripping up streets and sidewalks, you may as well wrap in some projects to improve the neighborhood itself, make it a little bit more beautiful. And in turn, if it's a place where more people want to go, then you improve the ridership of the streetcar system itself. As far as lane usage goes, streetcars often run in mixed traffic with regular automobiles. Sometimes they do have exclusive rights of way, especially to get around and bypass congestion. But you can also improve service with so-called BAT lanes, bus and turn, or business access and transit lanes, or just simply transit-only lanes, allowing only the streetcar to go in that particular lane, even though it's on a shared road. Streetcar termini are usually lane-protected switchbacks, simple tuning forks. Occasionally there's a loop, like you can see in the top right in Portland. But outside of this, there's usually minimal infrastructure with no crossovers or alternative routings. Another interesting concern is that often the tail tracks are double length. Like you can see in the bottom left in Detroit, there's actually a space enough for an extra streetcar behind the station. I think that this is built as a contingency plan, such that if a vehicle is damaged en route and can't make it back to the operations and maintenance facility, it can limp to one end of the line and tuck itself in the extra switchback space before being rescued later that evening, allowing the rest of the streetcar system to continue to circulate regularly. And the other examples of these tuning forks are in the top left in Kansas City and the bottom right in Seattle. Streetcar operations and maintenance facilities, or OMFs, are usually located a few blocks off the main line, and they're usually very small modern buildings with dispatch upstairs, repair downstairs, and then storage tracks outside. And probably one of my favorite examples of this is the Q line in Detroit. It's actually integrated with the turnback for this particular streetcar. But you can see here, it's just 2 tracks going into a building and then a few tracks of space outside for storage. It is very, very small and pike-sized, one even might say. All right, moving on to light rail transit. Most light rail systems often start as initial trial lines that then evolve into much larger networks. Like you can see, this is what Seattle started with. This is what Seattle is building right now. This is what Charlotte started with. This is what Charlotte is building right now. They've actually already extended a very large route of its streetcar system, and then hopefully someday soon it will have a second light rail line and a commuter rail line going into Charlotte Gateway Station. Also, here was the original line built for Minneapolis, just going south to the airport and the Mall of America, and then this is what Minneapolis is building right now. It already has the line all the way to St. Paul. They're currently extending that to the southwest, and then hopefully the blue line will be extended to the northwest as well sometime very soon. Sometimes there are rare super networks where light rail is actually the predominant means of transport for the city, like you can see here in Los Angeles, Denver, Dallas, and Portland, but these are the few exceptions to the norm. Interestingly, a lot of light rail systems actually have connections to airports in order to increase political favor. The idea behind this is that if you build a light rail system from downtown to a neighborhood, well, then only the people in that neighborhood actually get to make use of the streetcar. But if you build a light rail system to an airport, then pretty much everybody in the entire city has an excuse to use the light rail every so often, at least. And then this also provides better intermodal connectivity, allowing people to visit a city without needing to rent a car or have a driver's license just to visit the city once you're already there. Light rail also usually has connections to Union stations. Again, this helps to improve intermodal connectivity, but also Union Station projects have been used as a way to show that downtowns are still being revitalized. And then as far as we're concerned here, it also means that we have an excuse to run Amtrak trains. Sometimes, as you can see here in Sacramento and Dallas, the light rail actually shares station platforms with the Amtrak trains, but what is much more often the case, seen here in St. Louis, Salt Lake, and Portland, is that the light rail runs simply out front of the station. Unfortunately, outside of downtown, there's usually a very heavy commuter focus for light rail systems, with large parking structures and road and highway median routings. So, you win some, you lose some. These aren't exactly the most appealing or most urbanistically minded systems. But there is a movement called transit-oriented development, which is to take all of the areas immediately surrounding light rail stations and up-level them in order to make them both more beautiful, but also to have all of the necessities for everyday life, including like grocery stores and restaurants, and then also maybe new housing and transit-oriented jobs, like with office buildings. But also this is usually done in places only within a quarter mile surrounding a light rail station in order to preserve the rest of the neighborhood and minimize disruption to residents. But I want to make a point here that transit-oriented development builds neighborhood centers. And to make this point, I'm going to highlight the South End in Charlotte, which is a light rail only routing. For most of its length, it only has a light rail in the center and a pedestrian walkway on either side. And part of this actually comes out of the fact that it came from an old freight rail alignment through downtown. Although in Charlotte, they don't actually have downtown, they have uptown. So the actual downtown is the South End, but South End isn't the downtown, because downtown is actually uptown. Anyway, and you can see the South End coming out of uptown right here in kind of the middle. And an interesting thing started happening. Once the light rail system was built, all of the businesses bordering it, they actually turned inside out, and they took their forward-facing business fronts and marquees, and they pointed them towards the light rail, away from the roads that they were facing previously. And this has ended up creating an absolutely gorgeous and vibrant little downtown or nightlife neighborhood, one of my favorites in the entire country, where they have breweries and ice creameries and farmers markets and museums. It's just absolutely fantastic, and it's a joy to visit if ever you have a chance. But further demonstrating this point that transit-oriented development is associated with hip neighborhoods, I have so far found not one, but two different light rail system maps where the station names have been replaced with bars and breweries that you can access from that light rail station here in Charlotte and Minneapolis-St. Paul. So yeah, I think this speaks for me. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, why does this happen? And to answer that question, I'm going to use a joke from Jim Matthews, one of my favorite people. He's the CEO of the Rail Passengers Association. The joke goes, what do passenger trains carry? Everybody will always say, oh, they carry people. No, passenger trains carry wallets. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about it, but also if we wrap in another joke, you can start to see where we're going. Here's the joke. How do you know where the train went? It left tracks. So from a developer's perspective, this actually, both of these things work together, meaning that rail transit implies permanence. Yes, buses can be rerouted as a city changes, but that's not necessarily a good thing, because if you buy a piece of property that has a bus stop, there's nothing saying that that bus stop will always be there, and you might lose a very important source of foot traffic at some point in the future. Rail transit, on the other hand, you always know where the train is, you always can see where a station is, and therefore you always know that for the lifetime of the system, there will always be a very high pedestrian foot traffic near that station. And so developers prize neighborhoods and properties with rail transit access because of this. Oh, yeah, there's my soapbox. That's where it went. Anyway, moving back to regular model railroading things, the rights-of-way are often reutilized from existing alignments in order to minimize disruption to communities, and this means that light rail is frequently built from or shared with freight rail corridors, like you can see here in Sacramento, New Jersey, or Charlotte, where in many cases you'll have light rail systems running right next to or immediately adjacent to freight trains actively switching. Light rail also utilizes road and highway median alignments, which are not necessarily the best things in the world. You can see examples of it here done well in Seattle and Phoenix having a light rail roundabout, and you can see very bad examples of this both in Denver in the middle, where they attack the light rail right up next to a highway and have terrible land use around the station, forcing you to walk over a half a mile from the station to literally anything meaningful. But light rail sometimes still can have de novo rights of way, usually in the form of tunnels, like you can see here in Seattle, with the station clearly being patterned off of the Washington Metro in D.C. Or what's much more often the case are dedicated viaducts, like you can see here in Charlotte, St. Louis, and Dallas, where the light rail takes extended elevated alignments, usually to get them over major roads or intersections or points of congestion. Light rail is also different from streetcars in that it usually has more robust transit signal priority and grade separation, and sometimes light rail does run in mixed traffic, like you can see here on the left in Portland, but what is much more often the case, is seen here on the right in Houston, is a low row of bollards protecting the light rail's lane from regular traffic. So even though it technically shares the same road as mixed traffic, the light rail itself has a dedicated alignment which does not suffer from the same traffic. Light rail also usually has much more robust transit signal priority, shown here on the top is a map of the Rainier Valley in Seattle, where the light rail runs down, I believe, MLK away. And you can see here that every single intersection, every single road junction has some sort of a contingency plan, either to keep the light rail moving as quickly as possible and prevent delays, and also to protect other turning cars and pedestrian crosswalks from the light rail. So even though it does technically run down the middle of a road and goes through stoplights, the entire 6 years I lived in Seattle, of all the times I ever commuted on the light rail, I got stopped in the Rainier Valley by a stoplight only 4 times, and 2 of them were within 30 seconds of each other. So clearly this system works fairly well, all things considered. Light rail also usually has very heavy emphasis on intermodal connectivity. Light rail stations will often be integrated with transit centers, like you can see here on the top in Denver. And one of my favorite examples of this, although sadly no more, was the downtown Seattle Transit Tunnel seen on the bottom, where the light rail actually shared the tunnel with buses running through downtown. Unfortunately, though, with I guess technically fortunately, with the light rail expansion, the buses have been removed from the tunnel permanently in order to give more space and time for the light rail. Light rail also is known for its extravagant stations. Original and older light rail system stations usually resembled bus stops, like you can see here in Baltimore, but newer stations are usually much larger and more avant-garde and striking, like you can see here in Seattle, Phoenix, and Dallas. And the idea behind this is actually sound. Maintaining a beautiful station like this really often doesn't cost that much more money than maintaining a simple station, but the construction of it is only a one-time cost. But if you can make a very large and beautiful station that people enjoy waiting at, you can help to increase ridership from that station over the entire lifetime of the station for that one-time cost only. And also for this reason, light rail is usually integrated with public art projects, like you can see in the top right and bottom left in Seattle, and also in the bottom right in Charlotte. But one of my all-time favorite examples of this is in Houston in the top left, where the light rail glides across a fountain. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous and stunning, and more places should do this. It's a beautiful way to integrate the transit system with the beauty of the built environment. From operational perspectives, light rail usually has greater flexibility. They usually have some form of mid-system tail tracks, allowing you an option for a short turn, which is a light rail vehicle that does not go over the entire length of the system. It only goes in the more dense downtown core areas. Although this option has been rarely used, to my understanding, I think the only one that does it is the VTA in San Jose, where they simply use it to run an express train. But light rail usually does have frequent crossovers, allowing for partial operation. In the event that one main line becomes disabled, you can simply turn it into a single-track system on the other main line, rather than disabling or bifurcating the entire system like with streetcars. Light rail termini are also different from streetcars. They usually have a 2-track station with a double-track crossover leading into the station. Usually it's an island platform. Occasionally you can find 3 tracks at the end of the line, like in the top right in Denver, but these are more rare. The way that these operate is that usually there will be one LRV laid over at the station. An arriving LRV will then use the double crossover to take the unoccupied station track, and then there's about a 30-second lag, and then the light rail vehicle that was sitting at the staging then departs itself. And this allows for an operator layover and helps to blunt delays from long station boarding times. It adds operational flexibility. An interesting thing is that a lot of light rail termini are actually future-proof for later expansion. Like you can see here in the bottom right in Pittsburgh, they've literally built a double-wide stanchion to allow an additional viaduct segment to be placed right on top of it with minimal additional construction. Light rail operations and maintenance facilities are usually much larger than streetcars. These are often large yards with different loops going between an OMF building and outdoor storage. And these are usually located immediately off of the main line, usually in an industrial area where land is cheaper. All right, moving on to my next favorite mode of modern transit, possibly my most favorite, diesel multiple units. DMU light rail, or hybrid light rail, or just simply DMUs, they are fairly similar to light rail, like you can see here with the Capital Metro Rail in Austin, the Sprinter in San Diego, and even the River Line in Camden, New Jersey. It has a segment of mixed street running with automobiles seen here. But DMUs, they're a little bit more railroady, like these two stations you can see here in Texas. They're pretty similar to normal commuter rail stations. They are gaining in popularity. Austin just approved one of the largest systems yet, where they're doubling the length of their DMU system. There are, depending on how you count them, about 8 to 9 systems in the US and about 2 to 5 in Canada. The first system was the Trillium line in Ottawa in 2001, and the first stateside line was the River line in 2004, and most of these are in the Texas and California suburbs. Frequently, DMUs start with RDCs. This is to lower the initial capital costs, and then you later replace them with modern vehicles as funding allows. And then this is also done because, as we all know, RDCs are effectively indestructible. DMUs also often usually utilize existing freight rail corridors and share the rights of way while preserving freight service. Officially, there has to be some form of separation, but it looks like the rules are relaxing for a more European style of operation, hopefully sometime soon. And this can come in the form of physical separation, as in the tracks run next to each other but do not connect, or it could have temporal separation, where the DMUs run during the day and the freight trains run during the night. And interestingly, in the latter case, if this is done, usually there have to be gauntlet tracks at the station in order to provide the freight cars with a wide enough berth such that they don't damage the station. DMU OMFs are usually very small and near existing freight railroad facilities. Like the Austin Metro Rail OMF, it has, I believe, a mere 4 turnouts. The New Jersey Transit River Line OMF is right next to a major freight yard, and the Dallas A-Train OMF is in the middle of an industrial warehouse switching district, I believe. DMUs also sometimes have short diversions into village cores. Like you can see this, I'm calling it a bypass branch for the Sprinter in San Diego. Highlighted here is the original freight railroad route of the Escondido branch, and you can see that the DMU leaves it and hops over a highway for one station stop in order to better access Cal State San Marcos before hopping back over the highway again to rejoin the freight rail line. The New Jersey Transit River Line seen here has multiple instances in which the freight trains leave and rejoin the DMU tracks, and also, like I mentioned, several cases of median street running as well, right into the middle of village cores. I want to highlight an interesting part here that shows how tightly associated DMUs are with regular freight rail infrastructure, that of Escondido, California. It's the end of the line for the Sprinter, and in rapid succession, it has a small operations and maintenance facility with, I think, 10 turnouts, the Escondido Transit Center, which shares transfers with Bus Rapid Transit, and then right next to it, a small switching puzzle for the freight trains before the end of the line. It is just so beautiful and tightly associated. One could possibly even turn this into maybe a 4x8 layout. More on that in the next presentation. But overall, the point I want to make here is that DMUs are the most exciting and modelable mode of modern transit system. So, now that we've covered the details of DMUs, how exactly would you model modern transit? Well, let's start with the vehicles. Obviously, there are many European models and many old-fashioned North American models, but what about the stuff that we've seen here? Well, currently, there are no streetcars available. Two people, I believe, Island Model Works on the left, they actually do have a prototype 3D printed in O scale, and on the right, Interurban Models is actually working on multiple scales of the Brookville Liberty streetcar, but currently, to my knowledge, there's nothing really good on the market, except what you can find in N scale. Kato does have 2 options. Their mono-articulated light rail vehicle, seen here on the bottom, but unfortunately this is a very specific prototype, and unlike anything you see in America. And then their more bi-articulated MyTram streetcar, which was just released in 2021, seen here on the top. It doesn't exactly follow a strict prototype that we would see in North America, but given that it is in fact bi-articulated, it is pretty close to what you would see running on North American rails. Interestingly, Kato also has a track option that it calls Unitram, which is a snap together, a ready-to-run system of track, which does make it very, very easy now to model streetcars in N-scale, but unfortunately it does have one very serious flaw, is that the track runs down the middle of the roads, not the edges of the roads like what is much more common in North America. So again, in order to model a system prototypically, it would actually be a lot more work. But they do have segments that are integrated with stations and turnouts as well, so it could possibly make things easier for you. As far as light rail vehicles go, there are 3D printed options on shapeways. Highlighted here is interurban models, and it's not just a 3D printed body shell. It's what I'm calling a 3D printed kit, where whenever you buy the body shell 3D printed from Shapeways, Volkmar actually also sends you in a separate order for free a bunch of equipment from Bowser PCC cars that you can then tie into and add detail parts to the 3D printed vehicle, allowing you to run it. So basically the only thing you have to provide is a decoder and maybe a few LEDs if you wanted. But unfortunately this is still a very laborious do-it-yourself style of assembly, so it's not a perfect system. West Coast Traction Supply also does offer 2 additional 3D printed models that I believe follow this similar sort of setup, and they are pretty specific to Los Angeles area prototypes, but an important thing here is that they also offer a very old style of Los Angeles LRV, which is much boxier and high floor, which may allow for some light kit bashing of some of the other quirkier first-generation light rail systems. So again, just providing you options. Now, there is maybe some good news. Bachmann did announce plans to release a Siemens S70 streetcar in DCC and sound, but they announced this in 2019, scheduled for release with their charger, which has already come and gone. So maybe they're still working on it. Maybe we're going to get a ready-to-run DCC sound LRV someday, but that day is unfortunately not today. But I swear, the moment that it's released, I'm immediately buying 6 in, I don't know, all of the different liveries. Now, what about DMUs? Obviously, they're the easiest to start because they often begin with RDCs, and models of RDCs already exist, so it would be very, very easy to use this as a system. There are also various European models from multiple manufacturers. I think Pico seen here in the middle, and then Märklin seen at the top and bottom. So these are models of the Stadler GTW 2/6, which actually is a vehicle that does run on North American rails, but they are excruciatingly expensive, and they may also require different electronic setups. I believe Pico runs on North American DCC standards, so that would work. Märklin, on the other hand, uses the 3-rail Linux-based setup, so that would require a complete gutting of all of the electronics inside. But there are options. At least the body shells do exist. But thankfully, new as of 2022, Pico just released the HO scale NCTD Sprinter running in San Diego. And this is in DCC and sound and multiple road numbers. So this is the first time that you actually can buy a prototype of a North American vehicle that actually does run on North American rails in the correct livery. So I'm going to go into much more detail about how we can utilize this in the second presentation. All right, so now that we've covered the vehicles, what would a layout with modern transit look like? Well, as much as I love it, I unfortunately think that light rail is the least optimal option. Among other things, it requires dedicated infrastructure, and it has large stations and parking structures. All of this would compete with mainline freight trains and other scenic elements for space. Also, construction would be difficult, as for the elevated sections, you would need to build elevated concrete guideways, which I do not think anybody has any sort of system for in the hobby. And then also with the large, extravagant, and avant-garde stations, each station in model form would be a unique scratch build, so it would be a little difficult to pull off. But I can think of a few railroad-philic ideas, and here, I'm going to go through them in detail. The first one is very simple, just a shared right-of-way option. You have your freight trains, and then for a short segment, the LRT runs right alongside it. Maybe you have a station, and then it just autonomously loops itself, and it ducks behind the backdrop and continues in a loop form. Another option would be maybe a simple terminus. This would be a little bit more dynamic and would require a little bit more programming. You could say have an LRV come out from behind the backdrop and then go into the double-ended station terminus setup. Then wait a few seconds, the turnouts would switch, and the next LRV departs the station and goes back behind the backdrop. And then again, you could automate this. It's just a very interesting animated feature. Or if you wanted something more from an operations perspective, you could model an operations and maintenance facility, like these two options here. And the way that I would envision this is that if you have an operating session, you wouldn't have one operator for each individual LRV train going around the light rail system. Instead, you would have one operator's position as a light rail system dispatcher who would be responsible for moving vehicles in and around the operations and maintenance facility and taking them on and off the main line, like maybe increasing the vehicle count during rush hours in order to provide better headways. But once the LRVs would be on the light rail main line, they would then loop autonomously. So there is a way that you can integrate this with regular operating sessions. Also, if you have a downtown area or a Union Station, you could maybe have a segment of LRT street running, or maybe a subway system running below grade. I think this is a nice and fun way to modernize the traditional club layout trope of a subway looping below grade. This is much more relevant to modern cityscapes. Or, probably the most fun option, you could simply connect the dots. If you have a large enough layout at home, or maybe you're building a club layout, maybe in the big city area, you can have light rail stations connecting at Union Station, then maybe a flyover over top of the freight rail, mainline tracks, then maybe a station here and an operations and maintenance facility there, and then the end of the line for the light rail system, seeding the rest of the layout to the freight trains. I think this is a nice type of quote-unquote urban scenery, kind of a way to indicate to the operators that you are inside the city's metro area versus outside of it. I also think, though, that streetcars are a little bit more of a practical option for modeling, in part because they have a much smaller footprint and much less equipment, and they also can be integrated into existing layouts with minimal changes. And there is also a real-world precedent for short, terribly designed streetcar systems, so if it looks wrong, you're modeling it prototypically. But I would highlight here that you should avoid against token loops. Do not have streetcar tracks running down the middle of streets like they did in old-fashioned streetcars. Instead, have the tracks on the side and also have dedicated stations. And as best as you can, also program the vehicles to make stops at those stations as well. All of this better sells the illusion rather than just having a single streetcar just constantly making a token loop around the downtown area. Now, I also think that you could maybe have a heritage streetcar circulator, and this is beneficial because it works for more eras, pretty much any time from the 1970s to now, and there are also more models available. There are currently models of the old-fashioned streetcars, whereas currently there are not models of the current streetcars. But still, I would highlight to avoid token loops, do not have the center of street running, have modern platforms and lane markings. Show that the streetcar system is integrated into the cityscape. Now, finally, I do think that DMUs are the best option for modeling, in part because they use existing freight main lines, but add a passenger flair to it, so they can be grafted onto existing layouts with minimal, if any, modifications. There are currently DCC sound models available, and there are also models of European vehicles that could be fitted to minor adaptations or kit bashing. This also adds operational interest, as opposed to an isolated autonomous system. The DMUs are competing with the freight trains for train time, and would add some intrigue for a dispatcher. And then they're also extremely unique. Since it's really never been done before, it will intrigue fellow modelers and the general public alike. I can think of multiple ways in which you could do a DMU-style layout setup. The first one is to have a mainline-style DMU, such as you would see in Austin, and this is for kind of a lighter capacity commuter rail running down a medium-duty freight rail line. And maybe you, again, could have a start in downtown at a Union Station, then maybe a freight rail yard, and then a small DMU operations and maintenance facility, a station here, a village diversion there, and then finally the end of the line before again seeding the rest of the railroad to the freight trains. Or you could have another style of setup, like a feeder line, like what you see in San Diego. And this would be from the perspective of a small DMU service running on a switching branch line connecting to a much larger heavy commuter rail system beyond. And so this works with layouts that are already modeling commuter rail, or you could focus entirely on the switching aspect. So for the switching focus, it could be maybe a small shelf layout where the focus would be on the freight rail switching and then also the DMUs. But for the mainline style layout, the DMU would kind of be more of a scenic feature, coming in from behind the backdrop and sharing a station with a larger commuter rail or passenger line. And then, of course, the high iron freight rail drama just beyond. But here's possibly the most fun option. Why not be a real urban planner? Don't build a layout for modern transit. Instead, bring modern transit to an existing layout. Think exactly like a real urban planner would, by bringing transit to an established space. Where are the jobs? Where do people live? Which neighborhoods need stations? Also, which mode of transit will you use? Streetcars, light rail, or DMUs? How can you minimize demolition? And where do you have space to put an operations and maintenance facility? Another potentially fun option is to maybe model the near future. You can extend a real transit system to your layout. Say that you model Kansas City, which does have a streetcar, but say that you model a part of Kansas City that does not have a streetcar. Well, just pretend that they decided to expand the line to where it is that you are modeling. Or, if you are really interested, you could model the actual near future. You can look up state rail plans and transit projects in state DOT document archives, and you could maybe build or model a streetcar or DMU or light rail system that simply hasn't been built yet in the real world. And this is a brilliant proto-freelancing opportunity because you can't rivet count something that hasn't been built yet. But ultimately, I want to end on why should you model modern transit? Clipper ships. Clipper ships were a mid-19th century sailing ship designed for extreme speed, but had limited cargo capacity because of their very narrow hulls. And the clipper ship era actually culminated in the Great Tea Race of 1866, an informal race between 6 different clipper ship shipping companies. Journalists would follow the ships around the entire world. It was very big news of the day, and there was an extremely close finish. Over a journey of 99 days and more than 22,000 kilometers, the winning ship Taiping docked a mere 28 minutes before Ariel, and the other 4 ships arrived in the next day. But unfortunately, this was also the start of a transition era. The steamship Earl King sailed for London 8 days after the clipper ships left, but arrived 15 days sooner. So what if I told you that the best way to appreciate clipper ships is to model them? Now, yes, this requires years to perfect your techniques, thousands of dollars in supplies and materials, and lots of space in order to build your clipper ship models. But don't worry, modeling clipper ships is the world's greatest hobby. What would you do if I told you that? Would you model clipper ships? No, absolutely not, because you have no connection to clipper ships, and clipper ships have no connection to modern life at all. I mean, sure, there's always going to be a few fanatics that always model clipper ships, but not you, right? So here's my point. How is this any different from trains? 100 years ago, you had these things running up and down most major cities in the Northeast, and you had these things being built by the model railroad manufacturers of the day. You could literally take a model from around the Christmas tree, walk down the street, and then hold it right next to the real thing as it ran through your community. But here are the things running through more than 60 cities in North America in almost half of all states and provinces, and can you buy a model of them? No, because they don't exist, because nobody makes models of them. I think that's dumb. And I also think it's related to an outreach imperative for the hobby, in part because modern transit is so visible and recognizable to the general public. From the perspective of public service, you could use models and model railroads of modern transit to show the relevance of railroads to the modern world, and you can educate the public to vote in favor of transit initiatives. Also, on the flip side, this serves the hobby as well. Low-cost souvenir models of modern transit can ensnare newcomers, and this directly relates the subject of model railroading to modern topics. In short, modeling modern transit shows that model railroading isn't just a boomer nostalgia circle jerk. So, in sum, as of 2023, there are 60 modern transit systems in North America, 7 legacy light rail systems, 22 modern light rail systems, 20 streetcars, 11 DMUs, and 3 more under construction, hopefully to open very soon. And you can see all of them here. This was a very boring lockdown Saturday during COVID. So, in sum, Modern transit is a uniquely North American phenomenon. We have more than any other country in the world by a factor of 6. They represent the present and future of cities, and they are definitely a subject worth modeling. Thank you so very much for your attention. I hope that you've learned something and enjoyed the presentation.